have played almost 200 different roguelikes and roguelites in the past few years, and in my quest to find the most unique modern roguelike, I recently stumbled upon a game with some of the smoothest gameplay, an absurd amount of captivating meta progression, some of the most unusual but profound story, as well as some of the most interesting overall design I have ever seen in a modern roguelike. And I don't think many people are even aware of this game. So sit back and get ready for a lengthy one, because in this video, I want to take a deep look and share with you all one of my new favorite action roguelikes, a bullet hell shoot 'em up boss rush called The Void Reigns Upon Her Heart. This is Rogue Design, a series where we take a look at some of the most interesting and best designs in modern day roguelikes and roguelites. A quick disclaimer, I will be touching on many aspects of this game, so there will be minor spoilers, especially with this kind of genre. I will be excluding rare or major events and encounters. Also, I will from now on be referring to this game as Void Reigns. Before dissecting the gameplay, the game's many unique mechanics and boss design, let's first take a look at this game's introduction. In this day and age, we see new incredible independent games every day, and a lot of the times at a reasonable price. With how easy it is to buy and start a new game, a game's introduction holds more importance than ever before. If a game's start is too slow, complicated, or boring, players might simply move on to another title even if they haven't experienced the meat of the matter. Just looking at achievements on Steam for most random indie titles, it's easy to notice how quickly a vast majority of players lose interest. With or without a large tutorial, balancing out giving enough information without overwhelming a new player and keeping excitement high is important, and something that Void Reigns does better than many games. When starting a new file, players will be placed in a menu with many options locked behind question marks. A dream option is available, and if selected will reveal a whopping 715 possible dreams. Even without any context, 715 of anything in an indie game is a substantial number. Upon selecting story, players will see multiple hidden characters and multiple difficulty levels, providing a small teaser of the game's content. Players get introduced to the odd story, character, and overall mood, with the game outright calling our protagonist ugly and unloved, setting this unusual tone of love and hate, which we will be discussing in more detail later on. After a bit more exposition and character development, players are finally transported into the core gameplay, where they will go through a reasonably lengthy tutorial full of digestible information, introducing the main mechanics while still keeping everything within the context of the game itself, attempting not to break the fourth wall or immersion by fusing gameplay elements within the story. Once completed, the player will then be thrown into their very first run and start face to face with question marks. This window I find very interesting within the context of the game. While the tutorial had a cheerful sense of guidance, this next section is full of suspicions and a feeling of abandonment. We'll have to come back on these questionable question marks later in the video, since I think it's important to first understand the game's mechanics and gameplay. But do know that this is, in my opinion, one of Void Reigns' most interesting design choices. Just a quick teaser for what's to come. Choosing one of the two options will lead the player to their first boss and finally let them experience the true bullet hell gameplay. From there on, players will receive new tutorials in the form of conversations between the protagonist and her new friend, spread out between encounters, revealing more in-depth information the more they play. This system of not having everything be thrown at the player at the start and instead be split between future encounters is a nice way to not overwhelm newcomers while still keeping the gameplay interesting. Having tutorial pop-ups is a commonly criticized aspect in many action games, as it can disrupt the pace of the game. But since Void Reigns' runs are clearly divided in two sections, the boss fights and the encounter selection screen, I find these tutorial breaks to be enjoyable, especially with how hectic fights can get and how important this information ends up being for a seemingly straightforward-looking bullet hell. Because while the gameplay might look simple, the game has many complex mechanics that would take new players time before fully understanding these intricacies, such as a lot of the stat details and distributions. Instead of having to depend on understanding all the specifics, Void Reigns decides to take a different approach by having a lot of the information hard to find or concealed, letting players adjust to the overall gameplay and feel of the game before getting into the more complicated elements.
That took a long time to get it right. Like, when it released, I don't even remember what the tutorial probably looked way different. Like, I know it looked different. It probably had more information front-loaded to you. I know at some point, you know, you do the battle with Unit Lulu at the beginning, and like, it tells you, here's what this button does, and then it makes you do it right there. And like that's the first battle, like just the tutorial battle. And like before that, it would just tell you what everything did, and like people wouldn't remember what things did. I mean, still some people still don't remember. Like getting everyone to soak in all the information that pops up is impossible. Like there's no way to do it perfectly, but I think I've gotten it where more often than not people get the things because of the way it's all set up, and it's all spread out a little. It used to be a lot more condensed.
This method helps keep players focused on the more important aspects of the game instead of immediately being swarmed with information from the start. This isn't something many games have the privilege of doing. Hiding important information or mechanics could result in games being more boring or unfair at the start. But in this instance, the core gameplay is so significant for new players to get familiar with that more nuanced details aren't a priority to begin with. Taking an overview of the introduction shows how dynamic and engaging the beginning of Void Reigns is. An efficient and immersive tutorial that quickly transitions to fighting new bosses, discovering many abilities throughout runs, and receiving new tutorials in between the action, revealing new information players can start adjusting to while still having fun thanks to its amazing gameplay. Speaking of, let's take a look at this gameplay. At first glance, making a 2D side view bullet hell, or a shmup, doesn't seem like the most complex genre to design. The complexity comes with making sure that this simple gameplay is smooth and satisfying to control, and that the enemies and bullet patterns are well designed and unique with the right amount of challenge. The controls in Void Reigns are simple but complex enough to still require players to learn and get more comfortable with the more specific mechanics. Other than the traditional X and Y movements, players can also hold down a button to slow down their movement speed. This is called focus, and it allows for more precise movement, which helps evade slower, more overwhelming attacks. Faster bullets will generally be evaded normally with a default speed, while slower and more numerous bullet patterns will encourage players to use this decreased movement speed for better precision. At a more experienced level, focus can also be used to strategically move friendly helpers around, which are turret friends that follow the player and shoot automatically, and can be acquired through runs. This added detail of adjusting the helper's movements, depending on whether the player is in focus mode or not, is a nice touch for experienced players, adding another layer of strategy for runs that happen to acquire many helpers. As for the players' love bullets, more on that later, instead of holding down a button to shoot, player bullets are shot automatically and will instead be stopped by holding down the charge attack button. This will charge a more powerful attack that will cause much more damage, and more importantly, more damage to monster parts, which are small breakable parts of a monster. This ability does need to get recharged over time, meaning that spamming charge attacks isn't a viable strategy. Instead, players are going to have to be strategic as to when to use charged attacks to utilize their strength against monster parts. Players may want to adjust their movements in order to get those parts broken, since breaking them will reward more points, as well as help refill the player's charge ability. I really enjoy this simple mechanic, since it's easy to understand, isn't distracting enough from the rest of the gameplay, and rewards comfortable players who will utilize this simple mechanic well. Lastly, we have the panic attacks, which are the smart bombs or blank equivalent. These are limited time use panic buttons that destroy all nearby enemy bullets whenever the player feels overwhelmed or needs to reposition. Differently from other games that use a similar mechanic, Void Reigns' panic attack is a bit more sophisticated than one would first expect. They have specific stats linked to them, such as their size, damage, elemental type, and duration. And considering that numerous abilities acquired during gameplay allow players to obtain extra panic attacks as well as enhance the actual panic attack stats, they end up becoming quite engaging. Instead of simply pressing a button to clear the screen of bullets, panic attacks can also be used to damage bosses, as well as get bonus points if absorbing enough bullets, which could therefore be used as an offensive tool as well, allowing for more flexibility. It can also help keep combos from depleting. Shooting at a boss will not only reduce their health, but will also start a combo. While monsters are continuously taking damage, the combo meter will keep increasing, but missing shots for more than a few seconds, charging attacks for too long, or taking damage will result in losing the combo streak. Defeating a boss with a full combo will reward players with more points, which can then be used for numerous benefits that we will be discussing throughout the video. This means that keeping your combo high is important, but can also be risky. A player may be forced to move away from a dangerous attack in order to keep their health safe at the cost of losing their combo meter. Choosing to always be facing the monster may help reach a full combo, but can make dodging attacks more tricky. This is a great and simple way of having a risk versus reward element within the gameplay. Those are the basic gameplay mechanics, but the game also allows players to choose from multiple starting characters prior to any run. Without getting into too many spoilers, there are several unlockable characters. The more characters unlocked, the more unique they tend to be. Some may shoot different kinds of bullets, such as feathers, which are short-range spread-type bullets, or stars, which I'll just keep this one spoiler-free. They also all have different elemental damages and resistances, which pushes players to familiarize themselves more and more with these intricacies, but more on that later. These different characters will have their own achievements, their own abilities to find, and their own story to tell. In terms of the bullet hell gameplay, Void Rains is much slower than most other games of this genre. It's designed in a way so that players can fight a brand new boss for the first time and not feel cheated by unpredictable attacks. Even though the screen may be filled with bullets, the pacing is just slow enough for the average comfortable player to be able to react to, which is a great feeling. And this is also in part thanks to the smaller than perceived hitboxes and hurt boxes. Instead of having the entire character susceptible to damage, only the center portion of the player's heart has a hurt box. Interestingly enough, this hurt box as well as the enemy bullets' hitboxes are actually even smaller than the game may lead you to believe.
The hitbox is even smaller than it looks too. Like, I think it's a 6x6 pixel box instead of that circle. The circle is much bigger, and the bullets themselves also have smaller boxes in them than what they look like.
This is a great use of a hidden detail because of how enjoyable it feels to narrowly avoid bullets. Squeezing through enemies or bullets unharmed is a very satisfying feeling. Discreetly helping the player quote-unquote ever so slightly cheat their way out of a tricky situation by reducing hitboxes and hurt boxes more than their actual size can be very encouraging for these types of precise games. So, now that we understand Void Rain's gameplay, let's take a look at how they're implemented within a run. The story mode is this game's main mode and is where the traditional modern roguelike elements reside. Instead of having rooms to traverse or a map to navigate, players will simply pick from a choice of multiple boss encounters to fight. Defeating them will grant rewards and passive abilities that will make them stronger. They will then choose a new boss with different rewards, rinse and repeat while also encountering unique events along the way until reaching the final boss. While this game may have put a larger priority on the core gameplay and boss design, the roguelike elements are surprisingly still very entertaining. In my personal opinion, I think many action roguelikes that focus more on core mechanics and gameplay don't always have the best roguelike elements. And while Void Rains may not thrive on these roguelike elements as much as many other roguelikes, I think it's been done very well. Instead of relying on major mechanical adjustment effects that could be found throughout runs such as new weapons, new mechanics, or new abilities, Void Rains leans more on skill and player decisions combined with a fun core gameplay to create unique runs. In this game, the passive abilities found throughout runs are called gifts. They come in 3 rarities, 1, 2, or 3 stars. Most gifts are number adjustment effects, such as increased health, increased resistances, damage, movement speed. And while I generally am not a huge fan of roguelikes having a majority of their abilities or passive effects be number adjustments, in the case of Void Rains, I believe this works in the game's favor because of how extensive the core gameplay is. With the impressive amount of unique boss encounters, players will very likely not get tired of fighting them for a long time, with or without unique gifts. For the first 5 to 10 hours of gameplay, gifts just end up being kind of a nice bonus, while still keeping the encounters roughly 80% skill-based. They are an extra satisfying component for players to look forward to and are generally always going to be useful no matter the build or run, especially when first starting the game. As we'll be discussing later, gifts will get more and more interesting the more hours are put in Void Rains. One nice detail of the gifts I really do enjoy is their description. They are simple to understand and provide the necessary amount of information for most players, especially since there are many hidden stats in Void Rains, stats that new players may not be aware of. Instead of overwhelming new players with more information, gift-specific details are actually hidden in the player's inventory, as well as the overall player's stats. A player who is only a few hours into the gameplay would probably not worry so much about all the minor components of each gift and would rather have an oversimplified definition to instead focus on discovering new bosses and mastering the core gameplay. But for those familiar with the game's content, delving into the gift specifications becomes essential for understanding the more nuanced details and specific stats. As a side note, some gifts can be locked behind a challenge during runs. These challenges get harder the more stars the gift has. These range from needing to absorb a certain amount of bullets with a panic attack, destroying a certain amount of monster parts, not taking damage, and a few other challenges. This adds another layer of risk versus reward I really enjoy. Since players are able to see these challenges prior to their encounter, they can choose to take the extra risk for a chance at more rewards if they feel confident enough. Alright, so back to the gifts. How does the game determine which gift will be offered during runs? Instead of having these gifts be fully randomized whenever encountered, the options will depend on the player's karma, an interesting mechanic that rewards players' skill. Karma is generally collected by clearing monsters with a high score. The better the performance during a fight, the more karma earned. This means, for instance, not taking damage during a fight, breaking monster parts, having high accuracy so as to not lose your combo meter, and more importantly, fighting higher leveled monsters. But this isn't just a simple benefit, because while having more karma gives better rewards, offers a larger monster selection between encounters, and provides more hub currency, it will also increase the overall difficulty by increasing monster levels. For instance, a player may begin a story run at the lowest difficulty, Mist-Rain, and start fighting monsters around levels 1 to 3. Taking damage occasionally and not consistently applying a full combo, they will end up close to the end of the run with only a couple of monsters to choose from, a few 1 to 2 star gift rewards, as well as the monsters being around the same level as the start of the run. On the other hand, if a player were to start a run on heavy rain difficulty, fighting the first enemy already at level 4, proceeding to defeat monsters without taking damage while getting full combos, will quickly lead to having more monsters to choose from, more gifts of higher quality, but with the catch of monsters going all the way up to level 12 by the end of the run, 3 times the amount above the starting point. Even though having a small amount of karma might not be as thrilling as finding more gifts of higher quality, this does allow players of any skill level to enjoy the game. Not to mention that experienced players may want to play on lower difficulties with smaller amounts of karma every now and then for a few different reasons that we'll touch on later on. In short, the karma system is a great way to keep the game fair for all skill levels, while including some interesting risk versus reward elements. Should I attempt to fight this high-level monsters for more karma with the risk of not doing as well, therefore potentially losing karma in the process? Or should I be fighting a lower-leveled monster that may allow me to get a full combo, hit lists more consistently, possibly even resulting in the same amount of karma? I could even just focus on fighting low-leveled monsters, intentionally missing my combos to keep future monsters as low-leveled as possible, which is, once again, a possible strategy. It is up to the player to decide how they want to approach their runs based on the goals they want to pursue. 3-star gifts tend to be very impactful and obviously much rarer. They usually have more mechanical changes, which tend to be very exciting. Without much karma, a player that is still adjusting to the controls or mechanics of the game might never have the privilege of finding these unique gifts often. Luckily enough, the game took this into account and made sure to give players of any skill level the possibility to play with these more exciting gifts with or without high karma, by adding the anomaly system. During runs, if players end up with an overall low amount of karma, they will encounter a special chapter called Gift from Beyond. This event will allow players to encounter an anomaly, a particularly easy encounter with guaranteed 3-star gift rewards. In my opinion, this is a great way to prevent players who may struggle with the game from becoming desperate. This feature keeps the gameplay fresh and exciting by allowing every player to experience the enjoyment of 3-star gifts without always having to depend on karma. In a game with such a large focus on skill, I find this sort of donation very welcoming. Now, even though the roguelike elements may not be this game's focal point, they're still very important and well designed. As previously stated, most gifts that are accessible from the start tend to be simple number adjustments, so as to not distract players with complicated mechanics and keep them focused on learning the core gameplay. But the more players unlock new gifts, the more unique they get. Gifts that add new kinds of bullets, gifts that add helpers that will follow your movement and shoot unique bullets, gifts that create protective bubbles on the field. The more I was progressing, the more interesting these gifts would get, while still always keeping the core gameplay the focal point. Although one thing I was a bit divided on had to do with early game elemental gifts. Every monster will attack with specific elemental types, as well as be resistant or weak to certain ones, such as fire, frost, toxic, and a few others. Many early game gifts are element specific, whether it be raising the player's resistances to an element or converting attacks to an element. These gifts are a bit more situational and not always useful depending on the boss encounters. While I do enjoy the elemental mechanic, I only started enjoying them much later on in the game when I had more information about monsters and a better understanding of this mechanic. I kind of wish many of these elemental gifts weren't available right at the start, since many players won't really feel rewarded by these gifts early on because they do not have the ability to see the monster's elemental attacks and weaknesses, which I will be explaining why very shortly. With how important the elemental mechanic is in Void Rains, I was surprised when realizing that there didn't seem to be any tutorial on this topic, something I feel would have been fairly useful early on, especially with all of these early game elemental gifts. Then again, with how enjoyable most gifts end up being, I don't find this to be a major issue, and I cannot deny how impressed I kept on being unlocking and encountering more and more unique gifts. Overall, I find the story to be a great roguelike mode with a fairly short time commitment compared to other games, many unique encounters, and smooth pacing, all resulting in a rewarding final encounter for all different skill levels. But what I found most interesting within the mode itself is the way Void Rains decided to outright hide many of its early game content. During runs, players will have a choice of which bosses to fight next, granting different rewards upon defeat and helping progress the current build, just like any roguelike. But instead of actually being able to choose bosses and rewards, the first few hours of gameplay will hide many enemies and rewards behind question marks, making decisions ultimately random. This is an unusual choice from a design standpoint that in many cases would not work for most games. Not only are players unable to expect what's coming or gather any kind of useful information about upcoming encounters, such as elemental weaknesses or resistances, but they are also unable to strategize their builds since rewards are completely random. Not being able to give players the chance to figure out or attempt to plan out synergies in an action roguelike is a risky design choice. And yet this ends up working thanks to, well, a few things. When I was playing Void Rains, I felt that there were two very distinct phases between my first few hours and my later hours of gameplay. The first 5 to 10 hours of gameplay are centered around discovery. With everything being hidden behind question marks, all I could do was get into a random encounter and be met with, most of the time, a brand new or unfamiliar boss encounter that would reward new and random rewards. And while I wasn't able to focus on actually strategizing my build or fighting favorable bosses depending on elemental damage and resistances, it didn't matter to me because of how fresh and enjoyable the core gameplay was and how focused I was on just mastering my skills. Many modern roguelikes may not put as much priority on their core gameplay, as many of them will instead rely on the random nature of the genre to create unique and interesting gameplay within individual runs. For instance, most bullet heavens or horde-likes, as I like to call them, such as Vampire Survivors or Potato, have very minimal mechanics and basic enemy or level designs. Their enjoyment instead focuses on the wide range of interesting power-ups, items, and ability synergies to create satisfying gameplay. But in the case of Void Rains, the gameplay and enemy design is very enjoyable on its own, even without the roguelike elements. It doesn't really matter whether a player doesn't get to see their upcoming rewards, as they can simply be regarded as random benefits. And while always playing with random builds over and over again for the first few hours may sound boring, it doesn't end up being a problem because of the sheer amount of different encounters and gifts this game has. With how many different bosses there are, even at the beginning, worrying about synergies and strategies isn't as important as simply experiencing and discovering brand new bosses. To put it simply, I believe the lack of knowledge in the early hours of gameplay allows players to experience the bosses without having to worry about the more complex details of the roguelike abilities, as well as the boss's weaknesses and resistances. This gives players the time to focus on getting comfortable with the core gameplay, which is very important to master given how high the difficulty ceiling can get. So those are the first 10 or so hours of the game, but what about the rest? Well, this is where I believe the game gets into its second phase, where the focus now shifts towards meta progression and actual strategies. As players progress, they will collect gems of different colors, also known as tetrads. These are the game's hub currency and can be earned by doing pretty much anything that is tied to gameplay. But instead of focusing on purchasing permanent upgrades that directly impact the player, they can spend their resources on unlocking knowledge to finally unveil the hidden rewards, boss information, as well as the occasional minor permanent upgrades. For instance, spending 6 red tetrids will, as the game calls it, radiate or unlock information on the Lilla, which outside of giving some fun lore and random information, will also inform the player of this boss's possible level range, elemental attacks, weaknesses, and resistances. Spending 2 red tetrids on the bandage, a gift that was found in the previous run, will now unveil it permanently for future runs. With enough gifts and bosses radiated, players will finally be able to be more strategic and choose encounters depending on whether they have effective elemental damage against a boss or if the rewards are worth going for, as some may be more situational than others. And while this game's second phase might be less mysterious than the very first few hours of gameplay, it doesn't mean that there won't be new content to come by anymore. On the contrary, Void Reigns is filled with content, and I mean filled. Over 100 monsters, 219 different gifts, 66 bonus gifts, and hundreds of other unique elements to radiate. With this huge collection, tetrids become more and more important the further players realize how much there is to uncover. And this is why I really enjoyed this game's currency system. Everything can be radiated using these tetrids, and they are earned by simply playing the game. The higher the difficulty, as well as the better the score within an encounter, the more tetrids are rewarded. The higher the skill and risk, the more currency earned. But even at a low level, while still adjusting to the gameplay, many early monsters and gifts to radiate are very cheap, allowing players to progress comfortably within the game's pacing. And with the ridiculous amount of items to radiate, players will constantly feel rewarded throughout the entire game due to their overall affordability. I estimated that even if players were able to radiate, say, 3 items after every run, they would still need over 300 runs to radiate everything, and that's not even including the more unique and pricey items. Whenever collecting tetrids, it's completely up to players to choose whether it's revealing more gifts, monster information, or any other possible upgrade within other modes or events. All of these different ways to use tetrids are important without any of them being an absolute priority to do first. It's all up to the player's preferences. I find this to be a very enjoyable meta progression system that is rarely well executed in other games. Most of the time, meta progression unlocks in a roguelike are fairly straightforward. More health, more sustainability, more damage, but information is unique and something that seemed important from the start of this game's development.
Unlocking information, that was like super important to me. The whole meta progression became like information more than anything, really. That was planned. Like that was one of the first things I implemented right after a few boss battles. I did the collection, and like I already had the, like, you're gonna get these 6 colored currency things. It's essentially crafting. Like, you're not really buying, it was more of a crafting thing. You get these 6 materials that just all happen to be triangles, and you unlock the information. The colors represent different emotions, so like the way I set prices for radiating stuff is like what emotions matter to that gift.
Instead of simply changing a numeric value within the game's code, allowing for higher health or damage, here nothing changes within the gameplay or mechanics other than allowing players to be more strategic with the added information. A brilliant system, in my opinion. Even after tens of hours of gameplay, players will still be encountering new bosses, new abilities, or even new events. But instead of simply finding these 100 plus bosses through random runs, newer monsters and gifts come in gradually, and a lot of it is tied to the Dream system. Dreams is the name of this game's achievements, and saying that Void Reigns has a lot of dreams is an understatement. A lot of its design is focused around that premise. Any minor accomplishment is more often than not going to reward players with a dream. Whether it be beating a run with a specific character on a specific difficulty, beating a certain amount of monsters, or simply spending a certain amount of tetrids. All of these actions will reward players with dreams, which themselves will unlock more content. such as more game modes, more bosses, more items, power-ups, and even more music and visual backgrounds. The fact that this game has so many achievements means that players are constantly going to be rewarded for playing the game with not only satisfying little achievement notifications like any other game, but actual new content every single time. Even after 15 hours of gameplay, I would still be getting 1 to 4 new dreams a run, each one resulting in more stuff to experience. This constant flow of new dreams is also due to the fact that every boss in the game will have 2 unique dreams tied to them that may be completed whenever the player chooses to do so. These are specific challenges, such as breaking every single bit of Umbra's ring in a single battle. None of these dreams are necessary to complete, as they do not give any benefits to a current run, but once they've been achieved for the first time, they will permanently unlock more content, just like any other dream in the game. These boss-specific achievements are a great feature as they allow players to set their own goals during runs, whether it's prioritizing winning the run or trying to complete specific boss dreams to unlock more potential bosses or items for future runs. It makes every run feel unique, with many different paths and choices to make. The fact that every new boss will come with 2 new dreams creates this domino effect, as a new monster may have a dream that will unlock a new monster, that will have a dream that unlocks more monsters, and the cycle continues. And this is where I'd like to really emphasize one of Void Rain's greatest strength. With the amount of items to radiate and the amount of dreams to complete, players are always getting rewarded and are always able to spend their resources for more content. Every step I took, there was always something to do, something to achieve, and if I got tired of anything, I could simply move to a new mode or a new challenge or even just a new goal. It's honestly incredible how much content this game has. Funny enough, since the completion percentage of a player's profile is linked to the amount of dreams fulfilled, as well as the amount of content radiated, such as monsters and gifts, it takes a lot of work for that percentage to go up. And Void Rains is there to ensure that players understand that this game has a lot of content. Every time a player completes a run, instead of bringing them back to the mode selection screen, players are taken all the way back to the main menu of the game, where they will have to select their profile every single time and always get to see how low of a percentage their profiles are for the first many hours of gameplay. I'll never forget actually beating the game for the first time after my first hour, being rewarded with many dreams, and coming back to the home screen to see my file be at around 2.4%.
When you win a run, it kicks you back to the titles. Originally, that was like that was a way to make it easier for me to reset the data. Like you need something like that when programming it. But later on, that became like, some people were like asking, like, can it not do that? But I was like, that's where it goes into your save file and you see your percent. And like, that's such a big thing now. Like, you beat the final boss on your first run and you're thinking, that's it? Like, that's the whole game? And then you look at your file and it says like 1.3%. And you're like, oh, okay, I see. This is not close to being done at all.
Forcing players to go all the way back to the main menu of a game every time they finish a run doesn't sound like a great idea in plain sight. But in this case, it shows how important achievements and unlockables are for this game, and informs players that there may be more than just meets the eye. Because while most runs may not last long and may feel fairly basic at first glance, this low percentage teases players into thinking that there's a lot more to this game than one would first think. And there very much is. Not only are there once again many bosses and gifts to radiate, there are also many events, characters, as well as many different game modes. While the story mode may be this game's centerpiece, I cannot deny how surprised I was with how enjoyable and packed the other 4 modes were. One thing to note is that all of the other modes are completely hidden from players during the first few hours of gameplay, with 3 of them taking upwards of 10 hours of gameplay before being unlocked, reinforcing the idea that the story is what is most important and that players need to get comfortable with the game before tackling these other modes. Therefore, for anyone interested in starting Void Rains, I will make sure to warn you before talking about these mid-game modes in case you wish to not be spoiled. But before that, let's talk about Quick Play, as it will quickly be unlocked in the early stages of the game. Quick Play will allow players to fight specific bosses, taking away all the roguelike elements and random features of the story mode. This is a great way for players to practice certain encounters and learn fights they may not be as comfortable with. And while this may not be as much of a unique feature, Void Rains decides to, once again, take it a step further by making this mode much more interesting than it first looks. Players may only fight monsters they've radiated, which is another reason one would spend their tetrids on specific monsters. Quick play also comes with its own progression system, a leveling system, as well as a high scoreboard. Upon fighting a monster, players will earn points depending on how well they do. Destroying monster parts, not getting hit, and keeping a full combo will result in better score and potentially result in a Radiant Medal, the highest reward within this game's mode. Getting these medals will reward players with tetrids as well as experience points. This XP system will grant levels within Quick Play, which result in more content within this game's mode, such as being able to fight monsters at a higher level, being able to equip specific gifts, creating loadouts, and allowing players to experiment with different builds. Reaching certain levels in Quick Play also completes certain dreams on its own, including unlocking new monsters. Radiating gifts not only allows players to see them in the story mode as previously discussed, but also allows them to be selected and used in Quick Play fights. This game mode is a completely different experience that focuses much more on defeating monsters with the perfect score, focusing much more on precision and skill without having to worry about a full run commitment and any of the roguelike elements. Getting a Radiant Medal on every monster at every level is its own undertaking, one that may interest some players more than others. Outside of this game's own progression system, Quick Play can also be used to complete more complicated or specific dreams, such as monster dreams with tricky conditions. It's a great way to obtain dreams without the risk of ruining a run while tackling a challenging task. However, not all monster dreams can be earned through Quick Play. Some are locked behind a story mode to maintain the excitement and challenge of some of these dreams during a run. Even though Quick Play is full of content, it can be skipped altogether if so desired, and there is no pressure to progress in this mode, or any other mode for that matter. One of the beauties of Void Rains is that each of these modes has enough content to almost feel like a fully fledged game on its own. Speaking of the other modes, I'd like to talk about the last three as I find them to be much more unique. This section will be more spoiler territory since getting these unlocked does take some time. Feel free to skip to this time code if you'd like to avoid mid-game spoilers. This is your final warning. 3, 2, 1, let's talk about the Altered Story. Altered Story is a different variation of the main story mode. Here, runs are much longer for those who would like to see their character and builds grow stronger and are committed to more lengthy runs. These runs tend to feel more of a commitment for potential higher rewards at the cost of bigger risks. Similar to the Quick Play mode, Altered Story will also have medals awarded at the end of a run. The better the overall performance, the higher the medal. Longer runs as well as an end score makes this mode more competitive overall, with the ultimate goal of getting a Radiant Medal with every character on every difficulty. In addition, the mode also has a unique side quest where defeating a monster with a specific character for the first time will reward the player with a unique Heart Medal. This system encourages players to play different characters and fight different monsters whenever possible in order to get more heart medals, which can be used to get slight meta progressions within this game's mode. But probably the most important aspect of the Altered Story are the 4 hidden characters that can be unlocked by playing this mode. These are altered versions of the 4 main characters and play drastically differently. Without getting into too many details or spoilers, they tend to be much more complicated and have much more of a focus on risk versus reward mechanics, as they all come with pros and cons. Unlocking them in this mode will also unlock the option of playing them in any other mode outside of the main story from here on out, adding even more content since many dreams and completion marks are linked to individual characters. I like the Altered Story as I enjoy lengthy runs, and the medal system pushes me to go out of my comfort zone and get rewarded with many medals in return. The Towers mode is a bit more complicated. Here, players can choose to face gauntlets of monsters, whether it be 10 random bosses or all members of a certain family of monsters. What is most interesting about this mode, though, are the new types of gifts that can be encountered. Blessings, which are very powerful, unique gifts, and burdens, which are negative effect gifts. These two are always paired together, meaning that taking a blessing will always come with a burden, which all in all adds another layer of risk versus reward. These gifts will usually have very unique effects, but will only last a certain amount of encounters. Some may even alter gameplay and mechanics. For instance, a blessing such as Perfect Gift will reward players with a permanent helper for the next 9 encounters whenever a boss is defeated while having a full combo. But it might be paired with a burden such as Forgetful, which makes all future gifts appear unknown for the next 3 encounters. Not will let players shoot an extra wavy heart that will also split in mid-air for the next 4 encounters, while Photoxai will have players create 3 stationary quote-unquote helpers that will block players' shots, forcing them to be more strategic with their overall movement for the next 5 encounters. I find this mode very amusing because of how impactful these gifts are. Having these game-changing effects would probably not be suitable in the main story mode due to the importance of the core gameplay. If these gifts would have been introduced to new players early during gameplay, it may have been too overwhelming. But for a different mode that is only achievable after many hours of gameplay, it ends up being very refreshing. And lastly, we have the Endless Nightmare mode. Here, players attempt to go as far as possible in an endless run as monsters keep growing in levels. Loops or infinite runs are not unheard of in roguelikes, but Void Rains has an interesting approach to it. Instead of finding gifts as a reward for defeating monsters, gifts can only be purchased with Solera. Players are free to summon Solera after every fight, where she will have a random assortment of gifts players can purchase. They can also choose to spend Tetrids to permanently upgrade the shop for the current and any future run, which adds another new progression system players can choose to pursue or not depending on how much they enjoyed this game's mode. The twist to this mode is the Karma system. Just like the story mode, Karma will be earned depending on how well players do in fights and how powerful the monsters are. Some monsters may even come with minor challenges that will reward more Karma, which is another great way of encouraging players to attempt different monsters if they choose to take the risk. But instead of increasing future rewards and monster levels, Karma is instead used as the mode's currency to summon Solera and purchase her gifts. Summoning Solera increases every single use, which means players need to be careful how often they wish to access the shop. Using it often early on may result in more gifts, but will also raise costs as the game progresses. Balancing the system is very interesting and is another fresh and unique challenge that I very much enjoy. One of my most cherished memories playing Void Rains was when I had my first very long Endless Nightmare run. It was one of the most intense 1.5 hours I've had playing a bullet hell game, strategizing when to go to the shop, what gifts to purchase, and which boss to face depending on the elements I was favorable against. It kept getting faster and faster as I kept getting stronger and stronger until I was finally defeated 32 encounters deep. I was immediately rewarded with 9 dreams, each unlocking new content, as well as having accumulated so many Tetrids that I was able to radiate 12 new items thanks to that single run. One of the most rewarding feelings I've had playing a roguelike in a while. So it's probably important for a boss rush game to have good boss design, so let's talk about that. There are 103 unique bosses in Void Rains, and each one of them come with their own patterns and movesets. Instead of just having a large number of random bosses, they are split into 6 families: Shambles, Guardians, Glass Flora, Zaramex, Iric Glyphs, and Virals, I think. The families help the game keep a sense of structure, allow players to actually make connections and links between monsters of the same family, makes it easier for players to remember specific monsters, as well as complement the story. Each of these monsters can have different forms, such as Alter, Null, Rage, Shy, Shiny, or Dual forms. Each of these forms can add significant gameplay and mechanical changes. For instance, Roundsaw is a big eyeball with a large breakable saw at its tail that has toxic elemental attacks. Alter Roundsaw is a unique variant that is only found at higher levels, with changes to its elemental damage, movements, attack patterns, and overall gimmick. Finally, the Roundsaw can also be a Null variant, which adds Void to the arena the player needs to avoid and adapt to, as well as also having brand new attacks and overall mechanics. Each of these different forms creates unique gameplay and allow bosses to feel different from one another without having to create brand new models every time. Dual forms have players fight 2 variants of a boss. Rage battles will have safe zones players need to stay within, restricting movement. Shy battles include hordes of minions players need to get through before reaching the boss. And Shiny battles, honestly, you'll just have to experience those for yourself. But even outside of monsters' alternate forms, Void Rain's monster designs are actually all intertwined behind the scenes.
I always make a copy of one of the battles. Like, you know, when I start programming it, I make a copy of one and then adjust that one. So sometimes I have an idea in my head for a boss, and like I kind of grab a fight that's like I can think of as the closest one. I modify that one and start to like mess with the attacks until it becomes what I kind of imagine. But that also does this thing where sometimes the old attacks that were already there kind of inform what this new boss will become, and they all trace back to Burning Viral. Every single one. Like when I made Round Saw, I copied Burning Viral and basically deleted all that code and remade it because they're so different. But like that means every boss was at some point Burning Viral. All of them. Every single one chains back. I don't just start from scratch ever, because, you know, there's a bunch of code I can reuse and stuff.
Now, even with the impressive amount of enemy variation, I actually think what is most interesting is their level system. Each boss will be encountered at a specific level. This boss level can vary dramatically depending on how far along players are in a run, as well as karma. Every boss has its own predetermined level limit. Scambla, for instance, can be encountered at levels 1 to 4, while Bloat can be between 4 and 10. As one would expect, these levels will change numeric values within the boss, such as more health, attack speed, and damage, but Void Rains takes it a step further by also adding new moves and additional patterns to the monster's attack depending on how high the level is. For example, if we compare a level 3 Calorie to those of a level 9 Calorie, the level 9 Calorie will have more health, attack faster, and deal more damage, but additionally, her bouncing bullet attacks will consist of a string of 8 bullets instead of 5. Her rock attack, where multiple breakable explosive rocks travel towards the player, will be accompanied by waves of bullets at the same time. Her wave of fire bullets in Phase 2 will be accompanied by huge pillars of fire spawning from the top and bottom of the screen. A level 8 Lila, compared to level 1, will now have her large purple bouncing projectiles also come with strings of bullets, or have bullets spew out whenever touching the edges of the screen. Her second phase will have many more walls of bullets traveling from one end of the screen to the other, including new patterns. Fighting a level 9 Lila compared to a level 1 is a completely different experience, almost as if fighting a brand new boss. These are just two examples with a few featured attacks, but in most cases, every single monster from a low level to a higher one will have added bullets, brand new attacks, new patterns, and of course, more health, damage, and overall speed. But that's not all. In some cases, monsters may go past or go under their level limit, changing their attack speed, damage, and health even further. These under or over leveled encounters are more situational and will occur due to certain circumstances or certain gifts. One aspect I appreciate is that the number adjustments are random and can be identified by players prior to the fight, meaning that players may check to see which values have been modified preemptively and can make a decision accordingly. I would much rather fight a monster with higher attack damage than a monster with much more attack speed. It's a good way to occasionally add more levels to a monster whenever the game needs to. When taking all of this into account, the number of bosses as well as their attack variations between levels, this game's monster variety goes above and beyond. Now, one might assume that lower level monsters would quickly become boring for experienced players. However, this isn't always the case thanks to the game's difficulty scaling as well as specific dreams. Most game modes give the player the choice to start their journey on a specific difficulty. In the case of the main story mode, players will choose how hard the rain is falling. Each of these difficulties will determine the range of levels at which monsters can be encountered. Mist Rains will have monsters between levels 0 and 6, while Torrent will be between levels 7 and 15. Not only does this allow players of any level to play the game, but the game will also push players to get more comfortable in order to try the higher difficulties, so that they may encounter new bosses since many of them are locked behind a level cap. Now, once players are comfortable enough to consistently do well against medium to high level monsters, then there shouldn't be any reasons to play the lower difficulties anymore, right? But this is where the dreams come back in. With the ridiculous amount of achievements as stated previously, many players may actually want to fight monsters at lower levels in order to unlock many specific dreams. Even if some are locked behind level limits, attempting a dream on a level 10 boss when it could just as well be completed at level 6 is much more manageable. This creates a unique balance for experienced players. They could choose to play high difficulty runs to go as far as possible, aiming for high scores and more tetrads, or they can opt for low difficulty runs to complete more dreams and specific challenges that would be much harder at a higher difficulty. Having these two approaches gives every difficulty in the game some amount of importance, whatever a player's skill comfort may be. Higher levels are fun and challenging, while lower levels can be very satisfying when completing numerous achievements, while also having the satisfaction of feeling pretty overpowered in many cases. This is not to say that players will be playing both high and low difficulties equally. Most would likely be sticking to the higher end in most cases, but the fact that there is this choice is almost like its own game mode, where it's not always about pushing a player's skill to the limit. Taking a short break to unlock dreams and new content can be exciting to do, especially after fighting very high-level monsters on repeat. Going from hours of this sort of gameplay to this, in order to unlock new content, can be a nice break and very enjoyable from time to time. Last but not least, I want to talk about the story and the overall mood of Void Reigns. Unlike most roguelikes, this game has quite a heavy tone. At first glance, the game has a very unusual atmosphere. Characters are very emotional, regularly referencing love and friendship, but in this very dark and obscure environment. The story is centered around multiple female protagonists who are trapped in a cave, hiding from the constant reign of the Void. They are surrounded by monsters that at first seem aggressive, but are revealed to simply be in need of love. With the power of love, our protagonist's goal is to help all of these misunderstood monsters while creating new friendships along the way. The narrative was a very important component to Angel Polanco when making the game. As many would quickly realize, this story is more than just a fictional tale. It is a reflection of serious and emotional topics. Void Reigns tackles topics of anxiety and depression without necessarily being specific, allowing players to make their own assumptions about these messages. This particular tone is quite unusual paired with this kind of gameplay, which can understandably be a bit challenging for some to connect with. And while some players may not care or pay much attention to the lore and story, those who do connect get to experience an even greater immersion. In order to keep players immersed within this bullet hell shooter game as much as possible, many traditional violent gameplay aspects, such as the concept of bullets or hit points, are instead being masked to fit the narrative without hindering the gameplay itself. Players shoot love instead of bullets. Health bars are fear bars because monsters are just afraid. Items and new abilities are called gifts because they are given to the player after they've been loved as a token of gratitude. Giving these traditional gaming terms new words and meanings help keep the game immersive. Even the roguelike gameplay itself feels linked to the story. It's not uncommon these days to have roguelikes have a quote-unquote excuse as to why the game repeats itself, whether it be the curse of immortality or any other reason linked to the game's lore. In Void Reigns, the Void keeps coming back even after a triumphant victory. Even though the game mocks the player for not giving up, pushing back the Void leads to new experiences, better knowledge of the world, new friends, and the appearance of new characters who also seem to be struggling on their own. Almost every character in the game seems to have their own personal struggle, and I believe the game is in some way trying to tell players that nobody's alone even if it may feel like it at times. At least, that is my interpretation. I don't expect everyone to connect with this game on an emotional level, but I do find it delightful to hear how much this game seems to resonate with some players.
It's a really personal story, obviously. I'm just putting myself out there, which is why it seems to resonate with so many people, which makes a lot of sense. And, you know, early on, I was like real embarrassed writing it, like drawing it. Like, I was like, no, there's no way I can release this. This is like, they're gonna think I'm weird or whatever. Like, and I released it anyway. And like, I got nothing but positivity for so long. That was so incredible. It's like, oh, I must be doing something right.
Another immersive aspect are the monsters' backgrounds. Each monster has its own story, description, and personality. While not everyone enjoys reading about a random video game character's background, the fact that this is a boss rush inherently makes every enemy feel much more relevant, especially since they will continuously be encountered throughout multiple runs. But I think what gives these monsters the most amount of personality are the events. Just like everything else in this game, there are an impressive number of different events. Each of these events is unique and are generally connected to an individual monster. They range from doing a quiz for prizes, purchasing gifts with health or currency, random minigames, or even a fantasy role-playing game. These make each monster feel like a real character and can help them feel more important.
A thing that I've seen a lot of people like come up with, they get attached to like specific bosses. Like I gave every boss a personality and a little unique like description in the what has now become a humongous like library collection that you unlock as you play. And like they'll read one and be like, oh my god, that's like, I relate to that. So like they start to like this specific monster or whatever. And I think that's really cool.
In regards to audio visuals, the game has a very specific look that is quite distinct. While the overall tone is dark and gloomy, this doesn't mean the scenery and monsters aren't visually interesting. Monsters look very different from one another, from simple shapes to giant worms or even four-legged plant monsters. The background during fights uses parallax scrolling, which helps make the encounters look even more impressive within the seemingly big landscapes. And just like everything else in this game, there are many different backgrounds, 36 in total, and most of them can also be part of possible dream unlocks. The depth of field is significant enough as to not confuse anything going on in the foreground. In fact, one aspect I really enjoy is how distinct and easy it is to clearly distinguish enemy bullets. They are very colorful, and with the game's overall pacing, it's rare to get hit without understanding why or how, something that can be hard to master in a bullet hell game. In regards to music, Void Rains has 57 different tracks, another impressive number, and all composed by Angel himself. They connect well with one another and share many different themes and melodies that become familiar the more hours are put into the game. Some new tracks may sound familiar even if the player has never listened to them prior. One aspect I was very surprised to hear was how important all of the final boss music was, even inspiring the boss design altogether.
For final bosses specifically, I make the music first. All of the ones in now, they all had their music done first. If you have the soundtrack on Steam, or if you can look at it in my YouTube channel, I have a few tracks that are like not in the game yet. They're for final bosses that are coming up later. Some of like people are like, oh wow, I can't wait to see what this is. Like, this is my favorite song in the game.
We've covered a lot of information in this video, but when taking a step back and looking at the Void Rains upon her heart, I can honestly say that this game is one of the most impressive roguelikes I've ever played. While playing, there was always something to look forward to, always new goals to reach and attempt. Never was I asking myself, what am I supposed to do next? As I always had options to choose from without it feeling overwhelming. There are so many achievements that can be tackled in any order, at any pace, while constantly rewarding players with new content along the way. All of this in combination with amazing gameplay and design has made this one of my new favorite action roguelikes. I hope this video can shine more light on this amazing game that in my eyes deserves much more love. Pun very much intended. Huge thanks to Angel Polanco for agreeing to an interview with me. And if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like and subscribe for more deep dive game design analysis videos. Thanks for watching.